I'm an artist animator from Australia, and I want to get better at drawing with perspective. A quick note from the editor, who is also me. This video, especially the first half, comes off a bit like I'm trying to be Professor Perspective. That was not my intention when I set out to make this. I think it probably sounds this way because, especially in the first half, a lot of the perspective exercises are really straightforward. And so when I'm talking about them, there's not much to say except for to retread the fundamentals that make them work. Anyway, that's it. Now on with my first exercise. I'll start with the 1-point perspective box exercise. This is really simple because there's only one vanishing point to consider. This means one set of converging lines. The other vanishing points are so far away that they only create parallel lines. This means that the horizontal and vertical sets of lines on the box will be straight across and straight up, respectively. And the horizon line will determine which part of the top or the bottom of the box we see. So if the box is below the horizon line, we see the top of it. And if the box is above the horizon line, we see the bottom of it. When the box is smack bang right on the horizon, we don't see the top or the bottom. This type of perspective exercise is honestly pretty dry. I don't think it's helped me too much with my intuitive drawing outside of shoring up my understanding of the vanishing points. But in order to not just go halfway and do half a job, I'll rush through 2-point perspective and 3-point perspective and then move on to things that I actually think are really weak and need work. For 2-point perspective, we do the exact same thing as with the 1-point exercise, except for we're dealing with 2 vanishing points, which means 2 sets of converging lines. That still leaves us with one really far away vanishing point, which allows us to have one set of parallel lines. In this case, the vertical set. Finally, with 3-point perspective, we're dealing with 3 vanishing points and 3 sets of converging lines. While completing this one, I actually did find myself becoming a little bit confused. The extreme warping that occurred whenever I ventured too closely to one of the 3 vanishing points did serve to throw me off. Anyways, that's it for those exercises. We now have our boxes pulled uselessly out of perspective, and I can just run these boxes through the kaleidoscope to give the effect from earlier in the video.
Wow!
My first real application of the perspective principles was to freehand rotate a box. This skill actually pops up all the time whenever I want to rotate the head of a character or even the body of a character. When it's finally complete, it's obvious that something is a bit off. Because I drew the box freehand, I expect a bit of imperfection. That being said, this box is noticeably wobbly. My expectation was that I would need to adjust the perspective in a couple of the frames. In reality, it was just one frame that was off, this one, and the rotation was not adversely affected by just removing the frame entirely. It's not perfect, but that wasn't the goal. And it's certainly good enough to trick my eye. Then I just played around animating some boxes to create this title sequence. This title sequence was a nice change of pace as it didn't require the same quality control as the rotating box. So my next mission was to get better at drawing ellipses in perspective. But honestly, this was mostly about wheels for me. I've always found wheels difficult to draw in perspective, and this seemed like a good opportunity to really work that out. I started by drawing some easy ellipses, planes, and tubes and a wheel which I put together from a square in perspective. After completing these warm-ups, I was feeling pretty comfortable, and I wanted to move on to constructing a car in 3-point perspective. This was where my confidence died. The process was a lot more frustrating than I had anticipated. The first problem I ran into was spacing my wheels. This meant that I actually had to go back and rule out cross sections of the body of the car to figure out how far apart the wheels would be in perspective. Once I had done that, I still had the problem of actually placing the wheels. And there was another problem that I hadn't realized yet. I had to figure out how deep they would be on the other side of the car, the far side. This meant going back to the beginning again and turning the whole car into a giant block, ruling it into half sections so that I could figure out the depth of each wheel respective to the perspective. All of this before even considering whether the ellipses had been placed correctly. The whole time I was incredibly confused by the plethora of lines that I had accumulated. I can't help thinking that maybe it would have been less frustrating if I had produced something that looked anything like a decent car. In the end, what I got was a distorted Lego vehicle. I think my choice to construct in 3-point perspective probably had a lot to do with the poor result. I think cars that I've drawn in the past have been considerably improved on the one that I'm trying to construct from perspective. For instance, these were all drawn from pictures I found on Google Images, with the exception of the van, which is based on a model that I have. I do recall the wheels being very difficult to draw, but the difference between trying to construct your wheels by placing ellipses and just having perfect in perspective reference to copy from is night and day. At this stage, I figured it would be a good idea to just have a look at the anatomy of a wheel. With that in mind, I set about looking up some tutorials and some reference. These were really interesting. Firstly, I learned that a wheel is actually not shaped like a tube. A wheel is beveled on both sides. This is perhaps obvious when looking at the face of the wheel, where the rim sits, but much less obvious when looking at the tread of the tire. Perhaps just as importantly, I learned that wheels in perspective follow the fundamental rules of a cylinder, meaning that the far side ellipse will always be more open than that which is closer to the viewer. I did draw on a lot of material when constructing this wheel, but by and far the biggest factor in improving my understanding of the anatomy of a wheel was the Draw-A-Box tutorial by Uncomfortable. I think the wheel I produced was solid and believable, and more importantly, the process for making it was well understood. If I had to critique an area of this drawing, it would obviously be the rims, but I think the failings there come from a lack of properly studying reference rather than a problem with the perspective principles that I applied. For my final exercise, I plucked a reference image of an old car off Google Images. My aim was just to reproduce what I had selected by still using perspective principles. And I would classify this as a tacit and moderate success. I had really run out of steam at this point, and I just couldn't bring myself to finish the car. And that's it for my first targeted perspective study. It was really nice actually having this video to work on as maybe a little bit of extra motivation to try to understand some of the more tedious drawing principles. Anyways, thanks for watching. Cheers.